Okay, Rabbi says. So we're gonna. Last week we started discussing the sugi of Yarmulkas. We said over the story of Rav Pinchas Karitz's Einiklach and the Salavit Shas, and we spoke about some of the Chazals, but we didn't actually get into the nuts and bolts of the halachic aspects of it. Is it a Chiyav Gomer? Is it not a Chiyav Gomer? Etc. And this week I want to get into that a little bit, but I want to preface this discussion by showcasing, I guess, a sensitive rabbi from several hundred years ago. Not your run of the mill Rav, and he's relevant to this because he plays in strongly into the shaila about yarmulke wearing. Now, as we're going to discover, and we'll go through the makairos shortly, there are many rishonim, achronim, poskim, etc. on both sides of the coin. Some very prominent poskim who say that wearing a yarmulke is only a hanhaga taiva, a minig yafa. It's not something that's a chiyav gomer. And then there are many poskim, less clear, but there are poskim who say that wearing a yarmulke is a chiyav gomer and you have to wear a yarmulke. And this discussion, kilu, so to speak, between these poskim, although not all of them, because this person that we're going to discuss was earlier than that, is showcased in a tshuva from Yehuda Ari the Medina, Leon of Madina. In his tshuvis, Ziknei Yehuda, he has several tshuvas. There's two published tshuvas in Ziknei Yehuda that discuss the shaila, and it seems that there was a third one that doesn't make it to the tshuva sefer. And he discusses the shaila, and to him, it's actually quite a personal question, and that's what I want to discuss. So let's start a little bit by talking about his life, who he was, and the exception that he was in so many categories, and then we'll discuss a little bit the back and forth that goes on in his tshuva. So Rav Yehuda Ari the Medina is an Italian Talmud Chacham, someone who was born in the late 1500s. I think he lives, well into the 1600s. Probably he lived 70-something years. So if he's, he lived the end of the 15s, well into the 16s. He was born in Italy. I think he was born in Venice, and then the family moved. The moniker Modena of Modena means that his family was from the northern Italian town of Modena, where he came from. As a young man, in his early teens, he moves back to Venice. He marries a woman from Venice, and that's where he starts his rabbinic and rabbinic-adjacent career. Now, Rav Yehuda Ari de Medina was a genius. By all accounts, he was a genius. He writes in his own autobiography, Chai Yehuda, which is something that makes him unique on his own right, that he has an autobiography, which is very rare in the rabbinic world. He has an autobiography, a very raw and open autobiography. But in there, he writes a lot about his career throughout the years. And reading about him, it's clear that he's a genius from a young age. He's a child prodigy. He was able to read from the Haftarah at a young age, maybe at 2 years old. At his wedding, as a young man, a young teen, he's already gets some variation of smicha, not the full smicha, but a smicha schaver, some sort of smicha, which means he had already matriculated and he was considered some sort of Talmud Chacham of note. At the time when he moves to Venice, there's a rule in Venice that you can't be an official practicing Rav until 40 years old, and because of that, and this is described in a lot of detail in his autobiography, he struggles with parnasa, and he's working hard to try to make a parnasa. Eventually, he falls into the book business, not as a publisher or not as publishing his own books, but as editing and helping out with other people's svarim. This lent itself as well to a certain degree of frustration in his life, because he felt like he had so much to offer, so much that he wanted to contribute, from a literary standpoint, that he was not able to do because he didn't have the finances, and instead he was reduced to, aiding and assisting other more well-to-do but less qualified scholars, in his opinion. Interestingly, and this is like, I guess, an open secret, but it's definitely something that could be said over as he writes about it on his own, he suffered from a terrible gambling addiction his whole life. He has, in some of his Ziknei Yehuda, he has tshuvas about it, but in his Chai Yehuda, where he discusses his life and the ebbs and flow of his parnasa status and etc., you see his suffering with gambling. It was something that plagued him chronically till his oldest, till his old age. He lost a son in his lifetime. He had 2 daughters. He had a grandchild. He had somewhat of a tortured, pained life. It had its ups too, and those are less mentioned in his autobiography. But he was successful, and as a young man, he got the position to be the cantor and the darshan in the Sephardic shul in the Venetian ghetto. Now, Venice, if you've been to the ghetto there, it's a small world. There's a few shuls. They're all more or less in one square over there. And he got the stellar to be the Sephardic shul, which was a prominent shul in Venice at the time, and his primary skill, it seems, was being a chazan. He had tremendous opinions and atiyas about how chazanis is supposed to be done, what sort of song should be used, what sort of tunes should be used, the emphasis, and etc. And he was a chazan. He was also a darshan. He seemed to have been a very popular darshan. Based on his own recounting in the Chai Yehuda, you could see that the audience that he addressed weekly, between his various speaking positions and darshanis gigs that he had throughout the week, his kavua was between 300 and 400 people a week, which I think in the era that we're talking about, in the 1600s, that's probably a very large audience. Today with the internet, anybody could reach anybody, but back in the day, to reach 300-400 people a week was probably considered a very large audience. So he was definitely making an impact, and over time he succeeded more and more in the community. Although he had many adversaries and he got into all sorts of squabbles with other rabbanim, he was involved in various Italian machleksim that existed in the day, in particular the ones that were, northern Italy and Venice in particular. But over time, he definitely climbed the ranks, and rabbinic papers, kolkairis, and etc. that are published when he's in his 50s and 60s, he could sometimes be the first signature on the page or within the first three. So clearly he became like a very prominent, Rav in the city of Venice at the time. Now, Grada at his Levaya, at his Hesped, which was broadly funded by the shul, which Stam tells you that he was an Adam Chashiv, he was a person of consequence, of note. One of the Maspidim said that he was a Ram. For some reason that title has stuck to him, that he was a Ram in Venice. It's unclear exactly if he was actually a Rosh Hashiva or a Rebbe in the Yeshiva or not, or maybe that was just an honorific that was attached to him at his Levaya. But in any case, he was a prominent Rav of sort and public persona, public teacher in the Venetian ghetto in the era. Now, he developed a very interesting specialty. Now, b'chlal, you find this with Italian Rabbanim, that they tend to mix more with the local Catholic Church, ideology, culture, etc. Not mix in meaning that they're influenced by it, although I'm sure that's true to some degree too, but mix more meaning that they had to interact with it, meaning the local Catholics had a working knowledge of what Judaism was about, and the Jews had more than a working knowledge about what Catholicism was about. Often the Jews would be subjected to sermons in the church. They would have to spend some time listening to sermons. Rabbi Yehuda Medina himself, his sermons in the shul were frequented by many Catholic friends of his. He was popular amongst the Catholic world, to the point where he was contracted to write a book on Jewish custom for a Catholic readership. He wrote it, I believe, in Latin, but I could be wrong, maybe Italian, probably Italian or Latin. I believe he had a working knowledge of English. He had many friends who spoke English, like English Protestants and Catholics who had come in contact with him. He was well versed in languages, etc. And he wrote this book for a Catholic audience. It was later translated into a few different languages. Many of his own svarim, svarim that he wrote, which were more geared to discussing Kabbalah, often not in a very positive light. He was a big critic of Kabbalah and of Gilgal and etc. And these svarim came out later. Many of them were not published in his lifetime due to probably lack of finance. I don't think anything else, although had they come out in his lifetime, I'm sure they would have added to the controversy that surrounded him already, but they were mostly published, posthumously later on. In any case, the sefer that he did, rush to publish when he thought he was on his deathbed during a plague, when in his 70s, was the sefer Ziknei Yehuda, the Shailas Shuvah Ziknei Yehuda, which is a collection of his chuvas on various different topics, and that's a sefer that he did publish in his lifetime. Now, why are we talking about him? Because in the introduction to this book that he published for a Catholic audience, there's a picture of him there, and you could Google this picture, you could find this picture of him, of Leon of Madina, Yehuda de Medina, and he's sitting with a long flowing beard. He has actually a very rabbinic visage, he looks really rabbinic, but copiously missing from his head is a yarmulke. It's a prominent, bald-headed scholar who's sitting, for an etching, for a wood etch or whatever it is that they put in the front cover of the book, in the front page. Now, it seems that this was not the only time that Yehuda de Medina, neglected to wear yarmulke. It seems that this was something that was a long-standing thing, and it seems he was far from the only person. Indeed, in Italy at the time, it seems it was relatively common that many adults, when they interacted in the public square with the Catholics, either in university, academia, medicine, etc., or even just in business, they wouldn't wear a head covering. Now, to this end, Yehuda de Medina, in his Shailas Shuvah Ziknei Yehuda, publishes a few chuvas to discuss this matter, and in it, he does like a pretty thorough walkthrough of all the deis regarding Gilui HaRosh. And in Simon Chaf Aleph, here's the Shaila. I'll just read the Shaila. It says, Shaila Mishmei Demar Amru, we were heard in your name, and you see that he was a popular speaker. That was his his modality of communication. It seems that he said in the drasha, public speech in Parshas Veschanan, that not only are you allowed to walk, of course you could stand Begilei Reish, and you could even walk Begilei Reish. And this was very shocking. Many were taken aback by this pronouncement, this psak that you made, that they're allowed to walk without a yarmulke. We trust your reputation that you're not someone who would say something unless you could back it up and could explain it. So if you could just tell us where you got this from and if you actually said it. Now in the tshuva, he goes and defends himself broadly, and he brings the entire sugya, all the various rationales, and some of these we'll get into, of course, for wearing a yarmulke or not wearing a yarmulke. He brings the machlekes v'sheinim and the grayos from the Gemara and etc. And he brings the entire sugya to validate the shita that wearing a yarmulke is not a chi of gomer. It's a minig yafa. It's a minig yafa, and he says himself, I don't know if it's in this tshuva or it's elsewhere, that when he sees young men, young bachrim, boys walking without a yarmulke, he himself criticizes them and tells them to put on a yarmulke because they have no excuse. Meaning, he's not saying that one should never wear a yarmulke. He's just saying the professional world's kula to not wearing a yarmulke is well based in the paiskim, and therefore the Italian populace, who in those days in a professional setting wouldn't be makbid to wear a yarmulke, have what to be semichan. But of course, children and young and people who don't have reason should wear yarmulke. Now we'll see that in a shul is itself a separate shaila, and when you make when one is making a bracha or doing a davar shebekdusha is itself another shaila. Now what's interesting is in Tshuva Chav Beis, following this Tshuva, he brings as follows. He says, when they told over, I'll read you the heading, says, Kasher hirtzu advarim d'le'el, Rabbane Praga, v'le'yadu parton, they didn't know the pratim, heshimuni chinam, adasher kasavti lem reish milim, until I explained to them exactly the Rashi Prakim, piske v'yemer yasher. V'oidav v'zeh shemut l'sachik b'kador, u'birakita b'Shabbos. And then the second half of this tshuva is fascinating, is that he's matir to play tennis on Shabbos. So the first half of the tshuva is where he validates himself once again, albeit in a much more defensive tone, about what he said, that one need not wear a yarmulke at all times, and then he continues on and defends playing tennis on Shabbos. Now, b'chol even Shia, I'm highlighting this not to say that chas v'shalom a person doesn't have to wear a yarmulke. That's not today. That's considered settled law, and eventually, over time, as we go into the sugya more and more, we'll explain the various rationales, the sibas hadvarim, and why and how the minig took root so deeply. But Rav Yehuda Ari the Medina, who personally we see clearly did not always wear a yarmulke, has two tshuvas where he goes through it. One of them very, very defensive in nature. Both of them somewhat defensive in nature, where you can tell this is a personal matter to him, where he explains the shaila in depth. Now, what's interesting, if I can, one more just nakuda before we go into the actual meat and potatoes of the sugya, is there's a fascinating tshuva from the Melamed Lahayil. Now, this tshuva actually was so sensitive that it was censored. The Melamed Lahayil is Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, a German Rosh Hashiva, a German Rav in Berlin in the early 1900s. He took over for Israel Hildesheimer. He was close with all the iconic German Rabbanim. And in this tshuva, in Melamed Lahayil, I believe it's in Chelik Beis in Tshuva Memvav, Tshuva Nunvav. In some of the Maduris of Melamed Lahayil, if you look on Yitzhak Chachma, for example, there are some versions of this where this tshuva is censored out, and it's like a sloppy job of censoring. It's just missing from the page. It's just a blank, like they erased it. Now, later on Maduris, it's put back in, and I'll read you what was so controversial here, and it's interesting. In the middle of the tshuva, the shaila is about if a person could make a shvua by arkayis in a German court while not wearing a yarmulke. And the shaila that's being discussed is if it's chukas hagay or not. And the question is, are they making you take off your yarmulke because of chukas hagay, because they want you to be gayish, or are they making you take off your yarmulke as a mark of respect? The German court demands a certain type of decorum and respect, and this is the way that you adhere to that decorum, and you show that humility in front of the court. Now, he brings a little bit about the sugya of wearing yarmulke. He says, I don't have time, I'm not going to go into barichas, but he quotes the Gaon, which we'll see soon. And then he says as follows. He says, one second. He says, he brings, I want to find this line. He says that here, V'hinei be'eis hazos, in this time period, harabanim hayireim in Medinas Hungaria, Rabbanim in Hungary, machmirim ma'oid bin Gilei Reish. They make a very big deal about Gilei Reish. They're very machmir. He says, but Ayin, he brings a few paiskim, the Goyim Beroshim, that it's only a midas chasidus, and it's not a chiyav gomer. And then he brings as follows. He says a story. Hine, Bekila Kadesh Yireim V'Haftam. in the Chareidische Kehillah in Frankfurt, Bebeis HaChinuch, in the school, Shenes Yasid Me'agayin Rav Shamshon Fal Hirsch, that was established Rav Shamshon Fal Hirsch, Shani Yisi Meir Sham Beis Shan V'chatzi. I was a teacher there for 2.5 years. Yoshvim HaTalmidim B'Shas Limudim Shar Hamadim B'Priyas Reish. When they learn secular studies in the school, they sit with an uncovered head. Rak B'Shas Limud HaTorah Mechasim Reishin. Only when they're learning Torah, they mechasa their heads. This was done with the imprimatur of Rav Shamshon Fal Hirsch. Then he brings a personal story. It says, it says, the first time that I came to meet the headmaster of Shamshon Fal Hirsch when I was getting a job in that school, here, the proper etiquette, the proper respectful manner is to take your hat off when you meet an Adam Chashav. Maybe a different teacher will see Shani Eini Meser Akavim Me'al Harosh Lefnei HaDirector. And Rav Shamshon Fal Hirsch told him, when you take off your hat, your yarmulke or your hat. Now in those days a lot of people didn't wear a yarmulke on top of a yarmulke and a hat together, so it was one or the other. But when you take it off in front of the director, that is a sign of respect. It's not b'chukei. Now you could see why this tshuva was so sensitive, and somebody felt that it should be censored out. I don't know who took it out. I don't know who took it in. I don't know the whole backstory. Maybe someone else does. But one could easily see why this story was so sensitive that some felt it should be taken out of the tshuva, and later on it was put back in. B'chalef and Shia, it's another example of the non-ubiquitousness of the meaning of wearing a yarmulke. Meaning, although today this is a davar pashat b'yoser, and everybody wears a yarmulke, and Mitzvah Shem will go into the reasons and the development, etc. And befratach some sefer shita in part of his long-ranging machlokes with Aaron Choroner, which we've touched on in the past and we'll touch on again in this context. But it's just interesting to note this. That's the right way to say it. The non-ubiquitousness of the minig, and as the minig is developing. Now, I neglected to say this, and I don't want to leave this without getting to it. Back to Yehuda Arid Medina for a second. Back to Lina Madina. There's a fascinating Tzitz Eliezer. The Tzitz Eliezer has a certain. It's interesting. The Tzitz Eliezer was a rav for the Rabbanot in Eretz Yisrael. He sat on the Bezdin, the Bezdin La'irim together with Rabbi Yashiv and Rabbi Vadian, etc. So I think in the world's view, like the mind's eye, he's some sort of more. I don't know how to say this politely. Some sort of more liberal rav, but he has a certain kanoistic streak that comes up time and again in the Tzitz Eliezer, and it's a very interesting balance in his psakim. Now, interestingly, in the end of Chelik Yud Beis, in the end of Tshuva Yud Beis, it's part of Tshuva Yud Beis, and it actually segues very nicely into Tshuva Yud Gimel over here. The Tshuva Yud Beis, he's discussing the shaila of using non-Jewish music for the shuls, for shul functions, to sing kedusha, to an opera song, or etc. And we've touched upon this in the past, and maybe we'll touch upon it again. Some of the old tzvasische rabbanim and some of the chassidische rebbes who would take songs from non-Jewish sources, Agaret singers who take songs from non-Jewish sources, and we talked about this, and do songs have some inherent neshama that stays with them no matter who uses them for what use they are, but that's not really the discussion for today. But at the end of that tshuva, he says, Imachitum, Re'isi b'sefer Shut Zikna Yehuda la'achacham etalki of Yehuda Arid Medina. He says, once I was done this tshuva, I came across a psak in the Shut Zikna Yehuda, and you see right away that he doesn't like him when he calls him a chacham etalki, the wise chacham from Italy. He doesn't call him no honorifics, just a reb. Of Yehuda Arid Medina Simon Vav and Kuf Lamed Aleph, where in there he writes, B'sheva chazimra b'es hakneses al pichachmas hamuzika u'beheter kvelis mila atfilu k'yetz b'zeh. In there he has many like coolest when it comes to using music in shul, because Yehuda Arid Medina, like we pointed out, was very prideful and very, very busy being a chazan. That was one of his main claims to fame, and he had a lot of shittas about that. And he says, because he's busy praising, proper musical scale and instrumentation in a shul, he bashes Rabbanim. He says, he says he talks with great harshness against the chazanim who don't know about this, and he says, Ulam, and here's the punchline that I wanted to share that's related to us. He says, Ulam, don't take it too seriously what this Chacham Italki writes. Don't be too concerned if he writes something that seems to be a little outlandish and is a little, across the pale, past the pale. This was a wishy-washy man, a flippy-floppy guy, who changed his dais like a closed riddle. He fought with the Rabbanim, the local Rabbanim in his town, with no less vim and vigor than the way Maskilim fought against Rabbanim. And this is the punchline. That's a very sharp line, a harsh line. He says, not in the eyes of a few was he called a kaifer. He would walk without a yarmulka, and the loag mehaisru misachik kadu regel b'Shabbos. He belittled the people who asked ball playing on Shabbos. He was a gambling addict all his life. And if you read, he says he really buries him here. He says he was lacked some sort of Yiras Shamayim. He walked without a yarmulka. He allowed ball playing on Shabbos. He was a degenerate of some kind. He had a gambling addiction that lasted his whole life, although it was detrimental to his financial and to his shalom bayis. He still insisted on doing it. He couldn't shake the habit no matter how hard he tried. He said, "Chiber svarim neged chachmas hakabala v'azayir hakadosh v'oid lamed v'libud l'eschabim v'noitzim v'kaimreim." He was busy interacting, teaching, and learning from the goyim. Hittiv l'mizik chachmas Yisrael v'chachmas Yavon. He blended, secular wisdom and Jewish wisdom. Zilzul b'dinei min hagi Yisrael. Techidei hatafasei miyedei al tzarech hashmira aleim. While he was busy saying how important it is to stay, to be shemei Yiddish minhagim, he was mezalzel and minhagi Yisrael and etc. And he continues on. Al kain le'maylev le'mayrid klam mashakasav ziknei Yehuda b'tshuva sham. Ashal le'mayse chachmei irei snagdulai. Al kach b'charifa. So b'roshim hagayim bali gedilei tshuva about dvar shmuel. He says, Mela, it does not matter what he says in his tshuva, and you should just ignore it. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter to anybody. V'agav, he says, Be'inyin iser halicha v'yeshiva b'gi l'roish kvar holchu b'zen amusha, so b'frat b'zman hazeh, me'az sheki'ilu mishmaya kol anafik l'sura, and this is a very great way to summarize it. It's the element that we've been trying to, wrap our heads around, is that although the sugya, the shmaitza, and the paiskim, which we're going to get into, do not seem to be nearly as conclusive as society has it today, to where Yarmulka says, Ki'ilu min shmaya kol anafik l'sura. It's as if a kol came out min shmaya to Aser walking begilei rosh. V'chala yarei v'chari l'dvar Hashem medaktik u'makbed al kach ad la'achas. V'kasavti mizek tzas gam b'sifri shutzitz li'ezach elikdal, etc., etc., and he's going to bring another tshuva about it. So he says, v'achar kol advar menal nearly lefini istaiti l'halacha devade iser gilei rosh das Yehudasi. It's considered like Das Yehudis, and Das Yehudis is something that can't be suspended no matter what. Meaning, even if it's not Me'ikar Adin, such a Shaila Chamura, let's say it's not Mamish Asur or not Mamish Achiyev, but Afal today it's become like Das Yehudis, and therefore it's something that's totally non-negotiable. In any case, the Tzitz Eliezer in his zeal over here, he Mamish buries Rabbi Yehuda Medina, and writes very clearly that what Rabbi Yehuda Medina writes in his Chuvas is not Ma'ila Meir. It doesn't change anything, it doesn't add anything or change anything to the discourse regarding the halachas of Yarmulka. Now, what's interesting is the Tzitz Eliezer might be the only one who says it, pemalik, but I can't rule this out with any mamish certainty. But from what I could tell, going through the sugya of Yarmulka, almost nobody quotes the Tshuva Ziknei Yehuda. Although it's a pretty thorough, reconstruction of the sugya and of the paiskim and of the rishonim that are relevant to be discussed, almost nobody quotes the Ziknei Yehuda's opinion in regards to Yarmulka. And to me, it seems like there's an unspoken rule where most Rabbanim who were going through the Indian, biyodim or beloyodim, either they knew of Rabbi Yehuda Medina and didn't like him, or didn't even know about him because he was some sort of iconoclastic outside type of figure. He was not a regular, not a regular rabbinic figure. Either neglect or purposefully don't quote anything from the tshuva. So clearly, the Tzitz has a sentiment that this is something Kili Yardim and Shmaya, that it's a psak, and these existing differences that existed earlier on are not relevant anymore, seem to have held true by most of the Gedolei HaPoskim. Now, putting that hakdama aside, let's try to get into a little bit the meat and potatoes of the sugya of wearing a yarmulke or not. Now, we spoke last week. We mentioned the various gemaras, and I'll just recap them quickly because they're the cornerstone to this discussion. The gemaras that we said last week. We said a few gemaras. We said two gemaras from Sechtas Kedushin, from Chavtas and Lamed Aleph and Lamed Gimel, that seem to discuss wearing head coverings. Now we're going to see that it's a machlekes if they're referring to just really just a yarmulke, or are they talking about the extra second layer, the rabbinic head covering? But what we pointed out was that Rav Huna Bar Nachman, I believe it was, said the Gemara. I'm sorry, that was the Gemara in Shabbos, but the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Kufid Ches and the Gemara in the end of Shabbos and Kufn and Vav, and the Gemaras in Kedushin, almost all of them seem to be prone to reading them as a minig tov or a chumrah. Lamashal, the Gemara says, Teisili, he says, I deserve extra credit that I never went Daled Amos without Yarmulka. Or the Gemara that talks about Rav Huna bar Yehuda's mother, who said she's going to always wear Yarmulka so that he should have Yiras Shamayim. Or, for example, the Gemara in Kedushin that says, Leina Sivna, I'm not married, and therefore I wasn't wearing a Yarmulka yet. Well, now, if wearing Yarmulka is a Chiv Gomer, how could being unmarried be enough? How could that be enough? Or the Gemara in Kedushin that says, Rav Huna bar Yeshua, Le Maski bar Abamas Pegilur, she wouldn't walk. Amar Shechina L'mayla Merisha, which again doesn't say Asr L'halach, it just says he wouldn't walk. So, from all these various Gemaras that we quoted, it does seem, one gets the feeling that it's not a Chiv Gomer, it's some sort of Hanhaga Taiva. And because of that, and I guess we'll along the version of Maschel B'Gnos M'Sayim B'Shvach, we'll start with the Shitas that say that Yarmulka is just a minig yafa, and a fascinating discussion about the Goin's Shita about that, and then we'll move on to the Shitas that say it's a Chayv Gomer. Now, I just noticed now that we're running out of time, so I think we're going to hold it here, and we'll continue with the Shitas and all the Paiskim, the Mechaber and the Goin and the Marshal and others, in the full discussion of the Chiyav of wearing a Yarmulka or just calling it a minig taiv. And then I think after that, we'll move on to the Chasam Sofer with Aaron Charna, and then maybe after that, we'll move on to some of the exceptions, even in the modern era, the different Paiskim that discuss it. Okay, to be continued, Be'ezras Hashem.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.